And now to complete our geographic sweep of Western Europe after Rome, let's look at early medieval Britain. We're going to go all the way up until the time of Alfred the Great, but we won't cover Alfred in similar fashion to what we did when we looked at the history of the Franks. We looked up to, but not including Charlemagne. In many ways, Alfred is the Charlemagne of Britain. He just took about another century to come on the scene. So let's dive right into what can only be described as chaos. If any country in Western Europe really fits the mold for having a dark age, it's got to be Britain. The way that Roman rule ended in Britain was a good deal different than the way that it ended elsewhere. So in Gaul, there were still pockets of resistance in the 480s who called themselves Romans, that being 10 years after the last Roman emperor had been deposed formally. So what happened in Britain? Well, it's not exactly clear how many Roman troops were there, but there is a famous order from 410 where the Emperor Honorius withdrew legions from Britain which had not been affected by the 406 invasion, and they never came back because they were engaged in Gaul, which was a great deal more important. And that's another thing we need to get out of the way right now. Roman Britain was not important to the empire. It was not agriculturally productive. There were not nearly as many Romans settled there. It didn't produce that much wealth. It was more or less an appendage which had been added as a conquest for an emperor looking to add to his glory. It really didn't add all that much to the empire as a whole, though, and it was very much the most expendable part of the West. Now, Roman Britain had never been all that great to begin with, but because of climate change, it was the first place to go downhill economically. You could no longer grow grapes there by the 5th century, so a lot of Romans who were from the Mediterranean looked at it as kind of a dump. So they weren't really all that interested in it. We can tell from the archaeological evidence surveyed by Neil Faulkner that there really isn't as much activity. There aren't as many villas being built. There's not as much renovation. There's not as many public buildings. And compared to a lot of other areas in Europe, especially compared with Spain or with Gaul, the penetration of the Romans is relatively shallow. They don't penetrate the local populace as much. Not nearly as many people from Italy settled there over time and brought their culture with them. However, there was enough merging that, just like in Gaul and in Spain, there was a Romano-British population, and they were organized enough to mount something like a resistance to the invaders when they eventually came. In the early years of post-Roman Britain, things weren't all that bad. The local population had their problems, and they tried to recall the Roman legions, but the emperors ignored them. They had more important things to do. And they had to deal with threats from the north from a people called the Picts. We'll talk about them in detail. And the people in Ireland were acting as pirates and raiding the coast. We'll talk about the impact of that. Now, the Anglo-Saxon invasion was not a big wave invasion or something that came out of the blue. There was enough contact over the North Sea that the local population was able to hire Saxons to come and serve as mercenaries. Also, some Saxons took part in the overland invasion of the Roman Empire. And over time, though, the Saxons figured out that they could settle in Britain as foederati, and they figured out that the local population didn't have the kind of strength needed to control them, so they began to take stuff over. And they ultimately found 4 kingdoms in Britain: Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Wessex, and there are some others at different times, and that, of course, that process is not a quick one. The story here is not one of a massive invasion, it's one of a gradual settlement and a steady collapse of a central authority. Britain did not have the economic base to support a government as complex as the Roman Empire, so the locals who were trying to maintain a Roman-style state really didn't have much of a chance in the long run. Despite the fact that they're called the Anglo-Saxons, the group called the Jutes were equally important and probably about just as numerous. And obviously, England is called England, not Saxonia. So the Angles were probably more important than the Saxons, even though for whatever reason the Saxons get the majority of the coverage. I don't really know why. Anyway, over time, though, unlike a lot of other regions, there wasn't a big obstacle to intermingling of the populations, and so in the areas of England proper, where the Anglo-Saxons were able to conquer, there was a pretty immediate intermingling with the local Celtic or Romano-British or whatever you want to call them population, and that produced, what we know of as early English culture. So, there was no dual law code or anything like that, and there was no separation between like the Ostrogoths and the locals like there was in Italy. Studying Britain in the early Middle Ages is not a task for the faint of heart. The sources are few and far between, and the ones that we do have are not very good at recording history. Unlike 7th century Spain, where we have no narrative, but we do have state documents and law codes and stuff like that, the only things that we have are these really bad chronicles written by ecclesiastic historians who now don't leave their monasteries, have very limited control over chronology, and have a really weird bias where they're more concerned with the religious affiliation of different rulers than the details of their rule, or what they're doing, where they're located, what the extent of their territory is, things that would matter to a regular historian. So let's talk about a few of these guys. We have Gildas. He's the first surviving British historian, if you want to call him that. His work is called About the Conquest and Destruction of Britain. This is written fairly contemporaneously with what's going on. Now, it's sort of a history. There are some historical facts mentioned and some things alluded to, some persons mentioned. But for the most part, this work is a work of moral exhortation. He is from basically what's now Wales, and he's fleeing to Gaul. A lot of Romano-Britons actually went to Gaul, and they formed little pockets of, Romanity, I guess you could call it. Anyway, his work is mostly about how people need to be more righteous in the eyes of God and also be more manly. So it's not really all that useful, and he doesn't give us a lot of detail. There's also the Venerable Bede. He comes later. Some people call him the father of English history. That is a pretty big stretch, if you ask me, but what do I know? Anyway, so the Venerable Bede wrote the Ecclesiastical History of the English People. This was published around the year 731. It's our best and most detailed source, and it's still pretty bad. Basically, the Bede categorizes rulers based on their religious views, and that's about it. If you're a Christian ruler, you're the height of virtue, you're a great man, everyone loves you. If you're a non-Christian, then you're a horrible degenerate, and you're completely evil and horrible. So it's very deep and very nuanced. There's also the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. This was created by Alfred's Kingdom of Wessex in the late 9th century. The problem with it is that it's simply too late. It's not all that detailed because it can't really tell us all that much about things that happened before there were documents being kept. And the late date makes anything it says pretty suspicious, so there's not a lot we can do with it. If you want to get a really good sense of just how bad the sources are for early medieval Britain, there are still professional historians who believe in King Arthur. And the reason that they're able to do that is because our sources are not strong enough to provide us with the details needed to thoroughly refute such a claim. Now, there are some severe problems which should strain the credibility of any reasonably smart person, so let's go through those. The earliest mention of King Arthur is by a Welsh monk named Nennius in the 9th century in his Historia Brittonum, History of Britain. So that seems weird. We've had some earlier historians like Gildas and the Venerable Bede. Venerable Bede had access to more texts than anyone of his time. And of course, Gildas was fairly contemporary. Gildas does mention there being something like a Battle of Baden Hill, but he doesn't mention there being a guy named Arthur in charge, or even who or what was in charge of Britain. So it seems like a weird omission if Arthur was really as great as he's made out to be later. He also appears in Welsh mythology, but all of his appearances are after Nennius. So he's someone who was sort of inserted into history and myth at a later date. It's really a weird thing. But most of the Arthurian legends that we're familiar with were invented by two writers who are even later. There's Geoffrey of Monmouth, who wrote a history of the kings of Britain, which some people use as a history text, but most people realize is mostly made up. He was actually called a liar by many contemporaries who knew better. He writes in 1138. He goes into a lot of detail about Arthur. He almost certainly was not drawing on any actual text. Britain had very few texts being written or reproduced at this time, so it'd be unclear where he'd be finding these things at. And then the story spreads to France. Remember I said that a lot of Welsh immigrants had gone there to escape the Anglo-Saxons? Well, that means that there's still some interest in Welsh mythology in France. So in the late 12th century, someone found Geoffrey of Monmouth's work. This guy was named Chrétien de Troyes, and he then adds more details to the King Arthur myth, including a character who's basically French named Lancelot. So, the shit got deeper, but it still was completely unproven. When most people say Britain, they think of England. When I think Britain, I think of the British Isles. There are 4 different areas in those isles, and I'm going to talk about all of them very briefly. So first up, Wales. Now, Gildas was Welsh, and what he says about Wales is fairly useful. And he says that Wales started to sort of break away from Roman Britain even before the withdrawal of the Romans. There were enough withdrawals from Britain early under Magnus Maximus, the Greatest. Remember him? The awesome Roman emperor with the Trumpian name. So anyway, Magnus Maximus had withdrawn a bunch of troops and administrators to go fight his wars, and he of course got beaten by Theodosius, and things didn't really work out for him. Now, the thing is, Wales developed an identity, and the reason they have a distinctive identity is because they were the survivors of the Romano-British population. They reverted to their native Celtic language, and they retreated to the mountains of Wales, and they were not ever fully integrated by the English. They still have their own identity today, even though most of them speak English. There's a lot of Welsh mythology which talks about resistance and things, but it's very hard to interpret. But it does seem to have been pretty indirectly influenced by Rome leaving and then the Anglo-Saxon invasion and takeover of the East. The Welsh also form a law code of their own, and that will be in practice until England annexes the Welsh later on in the Middle Ages, in the late Middle Ages. Here I have longbowmen pictured. One of the primary contributions of the Welsh to the world is that they invented the longbow. So the famous English longbow is actually a Welsh invention that the English then copied. And many of the supposed English longbowmen on the battlefields of the Middle Ages were actually Welsh troops in English service, if you wanted to get technical about it. If our knowledge of what happened in Wales is fragmentary and a bit vague, but we're pretty confident that we have the basic outlines right, in Scotland it is worse by a long shot. We're not entirely sure that we understand the relationship between the Picts and the later Scots, so we're just kind of guessing, and I'm just going to go with the most recent school of thought, the one that is in vogue right now. I have no idea whether it's right or not. So anyway, the Picts, we know for sure, were to the north of Hadrian's Wall during the Roman Empire. They would paint themselves blue. They were basically kind of a Celtic people, and they liked to raid Britain. We also know that after the fall of the Roman rule in Britain, we have an Irish Gaelic presence. There's a group of Irishmen called the Scotti who settle on the west coast of Scotland. That used to lead people to believe that they overran Scotland by force and then imposed their name and culture on everybody. But archaeology now tends to kind of, suggest that was not what happened. There also were several kingdoms in Scotland, just like there were in England at the time. Most of these are very, very small and not really all that important. And although Scotland has never held the senior position in Britain in terms of really being able to direct the affairs of the island as a whole, there was at least one event where the Picts were able to inflict a severe defeat and more or less cripple an English kingdom to the south. So the Battle of Dun Nectane in 685, and I probably butchered that pronunciation, the Picts inflicted a pretty severe defeat on the kingdom of Northumbria. Over time, gradually, it looks like Gaelic became the common culture, and it replaced whatever culture the Picts had. It may be that they were similar to begin with, so it wasn't that big of a deal. I don't know. Anyway, the guy who is sort of the last Pict and the first Scot is named Kenneth MacAlpine, to use his modern, more anglicized name, and he found Scotland as we know it as a medieval kingdom. So that's probably sort of maybe what happened in Scotland during this time. Again, it would be nice to have good sources. They're useful, and I love them, but we don't have them. So, what happened in Ireland? Well, I think you'll be shocked by this, but we don't have very good sources, so we aren't entirely sure. However, we can give you a little bit of background here. So, in Ireland, there were no cities in the Roman period, and that means the Romans never settled there, and they mostly ignored Ireland. There was a little bit of trade back and forth with Roman Britain, but nothing too intense. Eventually, the Irish figured out that they could raid Roman lands in Britain and get booty, so Irish piracy became a thing. And the most famous kidnapped pirate victim in Irish history, and possibly in all of history, is St. Patrick. He was basically a Roman teenager living in Wales, most likely, sometime in the late 4th or early 5th century, so about the same time that the Roman presence is lifted, or at least heavily weakened, in Britain. And he's taken to Ireland as a hostage. He lives there for years, then he goes back home. And when he goes back home, he decides that his life's work should be spreading Christianity to the Irish. So he became a bishop, or not a bishop, but like a monk or a priest, or I don't know. It doesn't matter what he became, but he became a missionary. He went back to Ireland and he converted all the people, and that's why they have St. Patrick's Day. And yeah, that's why you can get drunk on St. Patrick's Day and wear green, I guess. Okay, so the Scotty went to Scotland. We talked about that. They obviously played a role in Scottish history, even if it probably wasn't quite as prominent as their name would suggest. We also know that Ireland, after St. Patrick, does develop a strong monastic tradition. There are lots of monks in Ireland, and they are interested in scholarship, even Latin scholarship, despite the fact that there had never been any Roman presence there. So actually, Ireland will have many more texts and texts being preserved than England at the time. Ireland will be copying Cicero in the Middle Ages, early and high Middle Ages, and produced quite a few scholars who then went on to the continent. I'll probably come back to it, but I think that there was one Irish scholar who actually went to Charlemagne's court during the Carolingian Renaissance. Politically, Ireland was a complete and total backwater, and there was no real push for island-wide unity until the Viking Age, when there was a lot of pressure on them to unify and fend off the Vikings. Until that point, though, they were content to be divided into small groups and rule over what are now the counties of Ireland. So, despite the mess that are the sources we have for English history during this period, there actually are people who could probably tell you about the varying fates of Mercia and Wessex and East Anglia and Essex and Kent, where apparently there's a werewolf, and Sussex and Northumbria, but I'm not that person. I'll just do the brief, quick and dirty overview of this. There's an array of kingdoms. The ascendancy shifted over time. At one point, Mercia was in the lead. That was the 8th century. You can see Mercia is pretty common there. It's encroaching on Wales. It controls the center of Britain. But ultimately, power will shift, and it will not be the most important kingdom in the end. Just like in Ireland, state building will be spurred by the arrival of the Vikings. So when the Vikings land, they begin to wreak havoc. One area of England will become the Danelaw, and that's basically the rule of the Danes. So literally, Vikings were taking over parts of Britain, and that will spur Wessex and Mercia to really up their game. So, yeah, that's basically what happened. Good enough. These things are all stuff you can find out about if you're interested. I didn't want to waste too much time on it, but suffice it to say that we don't know many details. We just kind of have a general, vague idea of who was in the ascendancy and who wasn't. One of the readings I assigned for this week was the Epic of Beowulf. I made a little bit of a mistake because I didn't realize how far forward in time it actually was. I was under the impression it was a 7th century text when I assigned it, so my bad. Mistakes happen. Anyway, this work was composed between 975 and 1025. It's set in Scandinavia, but it is written by Anglo-Saxons. And the main interesting thing about Beowulf, other than the intrinsic value of the stories about killing monsters and getting drunk with your comrades and, getting women and all that stuff, is that it shows a lot of interaction between medieval England and Scandinavia. The settlement of Danes there meant that mythology from Scandinavia was known to local Britons, and that they were spreading these stories amongst themselves, and that these kind of stories captivated the imaginations of Anglo-Saxon writers as well, when they eventually did start to write after Alfred. So, yeah, I messed that up again. Sorry, my bad. So, we'll talk about Alfred next time, and hopefully I'll have time to read up on new theories about him. Basically, right now there are a lot of people who are looking at the archaeological evidence of the forts and fortified towns in Britain. Alfred historically took credit for building all of these, but now we can look at the data and tell that many of these towns and forts were in place before he was king. So it looks like it's possible that Alfred was able to use his high level of literacy to take all the credit for stuff that his dad and uncle and maybe grandpa were doing. Anyway, the Kingdom of Wessex was successful because of projects like this. They were able to build a series of fortifications which made it harder for Vikings to attack, and that helped really stabilize Wessex. And he also had to build up a system of resource gathering and management and build up a semi-professional army. So all these things made Wessex strong, and that's why Wessex would go on to be the kingdom in the end, which united Britain prior to the Norman conquest. Next time we'll talk about some of the details of that, what this series of fortifications did exactly, how Alfred restored order, how he really encouraged literacy. We'll get into all of that stuff, but that will not be right now. We'll have to wait another couple weeks. And this concludes this week's long exploration of the Dark Ages, or were they Dark Ages? Well, you decide. It'll be on the exam.